And we have myself, Andrew. I'm also on the deployment manager team. And last but not least, we have Justin Caldecott, who's not actually on the slide, but I promise you he is actually in the room.
Yeah, honestly, hi. Yeah.
And Justin's the product manager for the deployment manager tool at Redgate, which we'll be seeing later. So what are we going to cover today? So firstly, Grant is going to recap last week's webinar, so he'll take you through some of the stuff that we talked about last week, just to give you some context. After that, we're going to show you how to use source control and testing to make database deployment much easier. And then thirdly, we're going to we'll give you a step-by-step guide of how to automate database deployments with Redgate Deployment Manager. And then just to wrap things up, we'll have a Q&A session where you can ask any questions to any of us or Grant about the tool or about anything that you've seen today or in last week's webinar. And we'll also have an exclusive offer for webinar attendees. So let's get started. So Grant, do you want to give us a run through of last week?
Sure. Well, I mean, let's just get the definitions up front here. I mean, we talked about it last week, so anybody who's attending, this may be a little bit of a repeat, but let's we'll just cover it for those who didn't make that. Databases are a problem, right? Databases are an issue. Databases cause problems in and around development, and the main reason that they cause a problem is this crazy idea that businesses have that they should have data available all the time. Because if we could just treat databases exactly like we treat code, in that, as soon as you've got changes you want to put in, you can boil off connections or whatever, but you immediately replace that bit of code, you drop it, you recreate it, you're good to go, right? But databases got that information, that the data that lives on, and so we can't simply throw it away. We have to keep it in place. And that's the beginning of the problem. Then the next bit of the problem is this whole concept around object relational impedance mismatch. What's referred to as the Vietnam of the programming world. I mean, you can look it up. I mean, there's long articles about it. And these two things tend to make databases become very problematic for development teams, deployment teams, and problematic for the DBAs who have to receive what's going to get done on databases. So that's a good rundown on the problem. Can we talk about the solution? There we go. So here's the idea, right? Databases are causing issues for development teams. Databases cause things to slow down, and frankly, to some degree, development teams cause problems for DBAs because of some of the crazy ideas that they come up with to try to solve the database problem. Here's my idea. It's simple. It's clean. It's not at all hard. Let's do this. Developers are absolutely great, amazing, skilled people, and they have spent tons and tons of time figuring out how best to work inside of a team environment and how best to manage code so that they can effectively deploy it. DBAs, we spent our time elsewhere, which is great, but what we need to do is follow the development paradigm. Treat your database exactly like code as much as you can. That means doing the following really quickly. Integrate tightly with your development team. Get in their pockets, live with them, talk to them, take them out for a beer. Absolutely get in with the development team. Create a process that you could repeat over and over again, and further, a process that you can automate. Get your database into source control so that it is absolutely getting treated just like code, that it's stored alongside the code, versioned with the code, labeled with the code, so you always know what's getting deployed, and and put tests in place so that you can ensure that the changes that are getting made into the database are not causing breaks. And absolutely, whatever development paradigm, whatever the local development paradigm is, whatever your local team is using or local teams, learn it. Learn that development paradigm. If they're doing Agile, if they're doing Scrum, if they're doing, feature-driven development, the new one I just read about today, it's an old one getting repurposed, saw an article about it. Anyway, I don't care what the development paradigm is, you hook into it and learn it and apply it to your database so that your database gets treated like code. This is the key to make these things happen. So let's talk about what we can do. Next slide.
Cool. So at this point, we're going to jump into the demo that we're going to use for today. So if I just go across to the virtual machine that we've got, we're going to run the demo. So to put what Grant's saying into context, we're going to see how it might work for a website which we've got. And this website is made up of both the C# code that runs the website itself and also the SQL Server database, which does the back end for this. The SQL Server database has the articles that you're seeing on the page here, and it also has some of the other stuff as well. So this is Simple Talk, which is what we're going to be using for the example, which is one of the community publishing sites which Redgate runs. And we have a couple of environments for this website. So this is the latest environment. As you can see at the top of the screen here, it's got latest in brackets. And we've also got a testing environment, which has got testing in brackets at the top of the screen. And we've also got a staging and a production environment as well, but we're going to spend most of the talk today just focusing on the latest and the testing environment. So what we're going to do is we're going to make a change, and we're going to deploy that change out to the environment. So to make the change to the database, I'm going to use SQL Server Management Studio, and I'm going to use one of the Redgate tools, which is a plugin to SQL. We're fixing the audio now. Andrew's moving the microphone, so hopefully you should be able to hear me better shortly. So this is SQL Server Management Studio, and we're going to use one of the Redgate tools, which is a plugin to that called SQL Source Control, to help us source control the database change that we're making and share that change with our teammates. So what I've got here is I've got my local development copy of the database, of the Simple Talk database, which is just for me. So what I've got here is my development database for the Simple Talk database. So if I get up a new query window, I'm going to make a change to the database to implement the new feature which we want to implement. So we're going to do two new features today. The first is that on this list of feeds on the right-hand side, the custom RSS feeds, as well as having SQL.NET sysadmin and opinion, we're going to have another feed in that list as well. So just so that I don't have to code live in front of you, I've got snippets for all the bits of things that I'm going to do, just to kind of help things not go wrong.
Because coding live never goes wrong, does it, David?
Absolutely not, particularly when you've got snippets like this. So this is the first bit of SQL, which is just going to insert into the list of feeds a new feed, SQL Server Rocks. So if I just run that SQL by pressing F5, you can see that the database has been updated. And the other feature that we're going to add to the Simple Talk site today is for each article, we've currently got the list of comments. But we'd also like to have the number of views of that article as well. So each time someone views the article, we'd add one to the count, and then we'd render the number of views here.
Let's see how popular Grant is.
So here's a bit of SQL that does that. So we need to adjust the table, which obviously stores the data, just add a new column to store the views. And we're going to also, that main homepage of Simple Talk is the result of just selecting from this view. So obviously when that page is generated, we're going to need to have the views of each article. So I'm updating the view. We probably shouldn't have called it views in hindsight because views has two meanings here. But the SQL Server view has been updated to have this column from the table as well. And again, I'm just pressing F5 to execute that SQL and changing my local development database. So at this point, my local development database has been changed, but how do I go about sharing those changes with my teammates? And that's where the Redgate SQL Source Control tool comes in. So I don't know how many of you have seen this tool before, but we'll go through it real quick for people who haven't. So essentially, SQL Source Control is a way of sharing changes that you've made between, to a database between you and your teammates, and also with source control. So source control is what stores the definitive copy of what's happened, so that, as Grant talked about last week, when you do a deployment to production, source control is the truth for that deployment, which means that you know that you're deploying the latest thing that you actually want to deploy. So here on the commit tab of SQL, so SQL Source Control's got 4 tabs. We're not going to go near the migrations tab today because that's kind of an advanced feature, it's kind of beyond the scope of the webinar, and I've already done all the setup before today. So there's 2 main tabs where you spend most of your time, which is the Commit Changes tab and the Get Latest tab. So Commit Changes is where, having made some changes, you want to share those with your teammates and with Source Control, and Get Latest is when one of your teammates has made a change, you want to get that change into your database so that you can develop on top of that change. So the Commit Changes screen is showing the changes that we've made. We can see that we've changed the static data in the RSS feeds table to have another insert into this table for that new category. And we can also see that we've changed the underlying table for the articles to also add in a new column for the list of views. And then the way the home page is generated is with this view, and you can see that we've changed that as well. So at this point, I'm going to add a new, I'm going to make a comment describing my changes. So I've added a new feed, feed, not food, it's obviously TTI here in the UK, and also store the number of view, the number of, you can see what the snippet's given, I can't type.
You said live coding never works well.
We should have copy-pasted commit comments as well. Cool, so having entered the commit comment, I'm going to click the big commit button, and that's going to go ahead and send those changes off to the source control system, Subversion, TFS, whatever you happen to be using. We're using Subversion here, but it doesn't really matter, the experience is the same for all of them. And those changes are now stored in source control where my teammates can get them, and as we'll see in about 5 minutes time or so, lots of other Redgate tools are going to get them out of source control as well. Just to kind of show you a little bit about what's going on under the covers, what SQL Source Control has done, so because Subversion and TFS store files, what SQL Source Control has done is it's turned our database into a collection of files. And you never really need to interact with these files yourself because you always use one of the Redgate tools to do it, and they just reconstruct a database from these files when it's needed. But this is just for people who are interested so they can see what's going on under the covers. So each object type in SQL Server has got its own folder, so we go to the tables folder, and then each table in the database has got its own file here. And SQL Source Control is managing all of these files for us so that we never need to interact with them. And what's stored in these files is the create scripts for each of the objects, but SQL Source Control will generate all the alter scripts from those definitive representations when it needs to. SQL Source Control is also great for storing an audit history about what's happened. So if you right-click on the database and go to View History, you can see this is basically showing you the history that's stored on the Subversion server or TFS server, which shows all the commits that have been made. So this is the commit that we've just made today. It's showing up in my local time zone. So because I'm in the UK, it shows up as 1612. Obviously for you, that would show your time zone. And you can see this is the commit that I did. And then you can see all the different files that I changed in this commit, and you can see the details at the bottom. So this is the views column that we've added, and this is the SQL Server Rocks category that we've added to our articles as well. So that is a very, very quick demo of SQL Source Control, which is one of the Redgate products. And at this point, I'm going to hand back to Grant, who's going to go through some more slides. So if I take him back to PowerPoint, and over to you.
Cool stuff. All right, so here's the deal. We talked about this a lot more length last week, but we've already said deployments are hard, right? Deployments are difficult, and database deployments especially so. Here's the solution. Always be continuously deploying. A, B, C, D. Coffee is for deployers, people. Look it up. Anyway, the concept is set up testing, set up continuous integration, as much as possible, even if it's just only structure and no data. Get copies of production, and then do deployments. Do lots and lots of deployments. More and more deployments. Automate some of them. Do some of them manually. Review some. But test them, test them, test them as much as you can, and then ensure that you're doing lots of deployments. The more deployments you do, especially against copies of your production system. Again, even if it's only a structural copy, the more deployments you do, the more assured you can be that when you finally get to deploy to the production server, that you've got a very high degree of assurance that you're not going to be breaking things as much as you can. There's no 100%, but you want as close as you can get. And the way to get close is to do lots and lots and lots of deployments, many. Always be continuously deploying. ABCD, nice and easy to remember. Guys, let's see how it works.
Cool, thank you, Grant. So at this point, I'm going to show how, we'll go to the demo slide. So at this point, I'm going to show how unit testing works with some of the Regate tools and also an open source unit testing framework. So there's an open source unit testing framework called T-SQL, which is a way of writing unit tests for your database. And Regate has built on top of that open source unit testing framework to add a graphical tool to create the tests and to run the tests. And that tool is called SQL Test. So just like SQL Source Control, SQL Test is an add-in to Management Studio, and it lets you see all of the tests that you have and lets you run tests, write tests, and see what's going on. So the Simple Talk database, which I've made a couple of changes on, has got some tests on it. And you can see that they're listed here. So we've got two different types of tests. We've got some SQL cop tests, which are, what those are doing is that these are best practices, that all of our stored procedures should start SP underscore, or that we should set row count, etc. Basically best practices that you want to enforce in your database. So these tests let you check whether you're following those best practices or not. And then this category of tests here is a whole bunch of functionality tests for our database, are things that we expect to happen actually happening. So I can go ahead and click the Run Test button, and that will go ahead and run the tests. And you can see that all these little things are going to be replaced with green ticks in a minute, because all my tests are currently passing. Obviously, if any of the tests were failing, you'd be able to see the details here. So if we go ahead and double click on one of these, we can see what the test is actually doing. So this is testing one of our stored procedures is behaving correctly. So the way that you typically write tests is each test generally follows three separate phases. So in the first phase, you arrange for stuff to be done. So you can think of this as like the setup for the tests. And then you have a phase where you act, just where you call some stored procedure in the database that you want to test. And then the final phase is where you assert that the code has done the correct thing. So we've got here a stored procedure which should add a record into a table. So we've called it with some arguments, and then we're checking that the table in question has actually got the thing that we expect it to have. So this is arrange, act, and assert. And T-SQL provides a whole bunch of helper methods where you can kind of prepare tables to be interacted with and check that you get the result that you'd expect. So one of the great things about SQL Test and SQL Source Control working together is that the way that tests are stored is tests are just stored procedures within your database. And they exist in special schemas so that you can easily filter them out when you're doing deployments. And the Regate tools do that automatically so that your tests don't actually end up on production. But one of the things we can do, because the tests are just stored procedures in your database, and because SQL Source Control lets you share any database changes between you and your teammates, what that means is that when you write a test, that test can be very easily shared with your teammates using SQL Source Control so that they can run it too. So this means that if you've written a test that a bit of functionality is working, one of your teammates isn't going to break it because they've also got that test on their machine and they can run it themselves. And again, just as SQL Source Control can share changes between team members, it also shares changes between you and Source Control. So this means that the tests now exist on the Source Control system, and in our continuous integration environment, we can run these tests to make sure that they're working. I'm going to show this very briefly at this point in the webinar because I'm going to come back to it closer towards the end, but I just want to show these tests actually being run in the continuous integration environment, and you can see what's going on. So we're not going to talk about most of this screen because we're going to come back to it later, but we can see here this is the same list of tests that we see in SSMS. There's a couple of SQL cop tests and then testing our email address, and you can see that all of these tests have got OK written next to them because they're currently passing. And if any of these tests started failing, whenever you do the way we set things up is that whenever I do a commit in SQL Source Control, these tests are run automatically. And we'll come into more details about how we set that up later. But essentially, these tests are run automatically on every single commit, and if ever any of these tests start failing, the developer who introduced the problem that caused the test to start failing will get an email. And this means that you get really, really quick feedback about the changes that you're making to the database and whether they're actually working in practice. So at this point, I'm going to hand back to Grant. So just bear with me while we do that. Over to you, Grant.
Cool stuff. I love how that works. Anyway, the thing is, when you guys are doing this work out there, I know that most people are not dealing with a situation where they've got a production environment and they're doing code against production, or they're doing code, directly into, they're doing deployments directly in production. That's just not how it works. You're going to be working with an environment that, starts in development, goes through some type of testing environment, QA, if you will, or something else, probably goes through a staging or pre-production environment, and then ultimately lands into your production server. So every one of these deployments is going to be ongoing all the time. And further, this complicates the whole issue. Every one of these systems, your development system versus my development system versus some other person's development system, they're all at different stages of development, right? QA system is at a completely different version than my development system. The staging system should be at yet another version of the system, and production obviously is production, and it's probably not going to match what's in staging, QA, and development as these things change, right? Change being the fundamental process. So you may do 100 development deployments in a week, 10 QA deployments in a week, 2 or 3 staging deployments in a week, and 1 production deployment in a week. But this stuff is going on all the time, and you've got to have the mechanisms in place to know and manage what is in each of these environments. Further, the ability to automate getting information into each of these environments. There's just no way around it. I mean, I've been doing this stuff for years and years and years, and this is fundamental to getting things ready to go out to production. So I can't wait for this part. Let's see how it works.
Cool, thank you, Grant. So at this point, we're going to show you the Redgate Deployment Manager tool, which is the tool that me and Andrew and Justin all work on. So this is the website for the Deployment Manager tool, and it's great for because of the little pictures in the center of the screen here, it's great for me to tell you kind of how it works. So Deployment Manager, basically there are 3 things that you have to do to use it. The first thing you do is you have to package up your application and your database into packages, and then you give those packages to Deployment Manager. Now that those packages are in Deployment Manager, you can obviously view them through the Deployment Manager UI, which we'll see in great detail throughout the webinar. And then finally, you can deploy those packages out to the different environments. The reason why we chose to design Deployment Manager in this way is it means that when you deploy to a testing environment and do some tests on what's deployed, when you come, say, in a couple of weeks' time to deploy that change to production, what you want to have is the certainty that what you're deploying to production is exactly the same thing that you deployed to testing, that you did all your manual or automated tests on. And that's one of the things that our architecture lets us have. Because you packaged up your application and your database and gave those packages to Deployment Manager, and crucially, once you package it up, that package doesn't change. You can package it up again, and that gives you a new version, but each version doesn't change. So when you deploy a version out to your test environment and run some tests and everything's fine, when you later come to deploy that out to the production environment, you know that because you're deploying the same thing, because the packages are the same thing, and because you packaged up in the first place, what you're deploying to production is the same thing. And that's really where the value of Deployment Manager comes from. It's the fact that deployments are now repeatable. If you deploy something this week and something next week, exactly the same thing happens, which is crucial when you've got lots of different environments and you want to manage changes going between them. So how does Deployment Manager work? So Deployment Manager is, there's a central server component, which you have to install on some server somewhere in your organization, and this is the thing that manages the deployments. And then there's a lightweight agent process, which you have to install on all of the machines that you want to deploy to. And the agent and the server talk to each other, and the server sends all the things to the agents that it wants the agent to deploy on that machine. There's also a portal, which is basically a website. We call it a portal, but it's basically a website, which is how you interact with Deployment Manager and that's essentially what the screenshot from number 2 is in the middle of the screen. And the portal connects to the server, which is how it knows what to show you. But you can think of the server and the portal as one thing. Cool. So we first released Deployment Manager, I think, November last year. Since
a while
then,
ago now,
yeah, quite a while ago now. So since then, we've been going quite strong. Version 2 came out a couple of months ago. Version 2 added a lot of Version 2 added some new features. So there was a permissions model, which is obviously absolutely critical to a lot of people because they don't want every single user to be able to deploy to production. They want to lock down certain environments that only certain users can deploy to them. And also we reskinned our entire UI. So on the surface, it just changed from green to red, but lots of other things happen beneath the surface. We made it a whole lot easier to use, and we also made it respond better to different screen resolutions, which is particularly important with people with smartphones viewing the website.
So it now actually works on a tablet, doesn't it, which is really cool. So you can deploy your database from a tablet. So.
Which is very cool. So this is what the dashboard of Deployment Manager looks like. So what you're seeing here, so this is the main kind of view to show you an overview of what's going on. So you can see we've got a whole bunch of different environments. So we've got latest, which is the absolute bleeding edge. Testing, which is the environment that our testers are doing some manual tests on right now. And then obviously we've got staging and production. And I should point out that Deployment Manager is completely configurable. So just because we happen to set it up with 4 environments with these names, you don't have to. If you want to have an environment called UAT, that's fine too. If you don't want a staging environment, then you can set it up like that. We would obviously recommend that you have a staging environment, but you can go ahead and not have one of those if you like. And you can have as many environments as you like. Obviously, if you add like more than 6, you need a wider screen than this, but...
Or you can just scroll along, you know?
Or you can just scroll. And then as well as the environments which go across the top, we have the projects which go down the side. So often, DevOps teams are responsible for a vast amount of stuff. Certainly our DevOps team here is responsible for everything from licensing server to check for updates server to the shopping carts to all the intranet stuff to all our analysis stuff, and you end up with lots and lots of projects. And each project is basically shown down the left-hand side. So we've only got 2 in this example here, which is the Simple Talk website, which we're going to be using for the webinar, and there's just another project here as well, just to show you what Deployment Manager looks like if you've got a second project.
But our DevOps dashboard is so incredible, isn't it? It's got so many different environments, so many different projects. It just looks incredible. But
and to be fair, this is so the thing that DevOps found obviously is they started using it for one project and they found it so awesome that they just migrated all of their projects onto it. So it very much does grow over time as you put more and more stuff onto it, which is quite awesome. So this is basically a matrix, and in each of the, so this basically is telling you the current version of Simple Talk, which is deployed to latest, and then this is the current version of Simple Talk deployed to testing, and the current version of Simple Talk deployed to staging, and so forth. If we go into the Environments tab, we can see this is how we set it up. Again, as I said before, it's completely configurable, so you can obviously add as many environments as you like. You can reorder them, so if you wanted to deploy to production before staging, then that's absolutely fine. Obviously, we don't recommend that, so I'll just cancel that change. And obviously, you can add machines to each of the environments. So this is how you configure the machines that you're deploying to, and then these machines are then reusable across all of the projects. And then to tell Deployment Manager how to deploy to a machine, you do that in the context of a project. So if we go ahead and look at the Simple Talk project, and then if we go into the variables bit of that. So variables are how you tell Deployment Manager what the differences are between your environments. So obviously we'd recommend that you keep the differences between your environments as small as possible, so that if something works in testing, it's likely to work in production. But there are things that you do want to change between the environments. Things like passwords, for example. You typically want different passwords to be used in development environments to production so that you can keep production passwords secure. And there might be some other settings as well, like API keys, or in this case, like the name of the database that we use. So just to make this demo really easy for us and to stop things going wrong, we run the entire demo on one machine, which is why some of the things that you see here kind of probably aren't how they're going to be represented for you, but that's just to help us run the webinar with less risk, basically. So what I've got up on the screen right now is Internet Information Services Manager, which is basically IIS, which is where our website is running. And you can see that we've got all 4 the SimpleTalk, all 4 different environments of the SimpleTalk website running on this machine. But obviously in practice for you, they'd probably be scattered over different machines in your infrastructure. So you obviously have to tell Deployment Manager when it does a deployment to the SimpleTalk website, which one of these websites it's going to update. And that's what this website name is here at the top, which basically says that when we do a deployment, we should affect the website SimpleTalk_ and then whichever environment we're deploying to. So when we do a deployment to the latest environment, that's the website we update. And when we deploy to production, that's the website we update. And similarly, as well as the website, the SimpleTalk has a database behind it as well. And that's what the next few variables are all about. They're telling Deployment Manager how to do the database update. So this is the name of the database, this is the username to connect to it, and this is the password here, which you can see Deployment Manager has starred this out, and there's absolutely no way to get at the password. So this is great because you can put your production passwords in here, and all you need to do is click this mask button over here, and then they get protected once you click the save button, so no other user can get them. I'll just cancel that change, however. Cool, so that's the variables section of Deployment Manager, which is how you configure it to do deployments in different ways for the different environments. So now we should probably go back to the beginning in the 1, 2, 3 and show you how to publish your application and your database to Deployment Manager. So the first thing we're going to start off with is the database. So we have 2 different ways of packaging up a database so that you can use it in Deployment Manager. The first is a GUI tool, which is an add-in to SQL Server Management Studio. Makes it really easy to package up the database so that you can use the database in Deployment Manager. And the second way to package it up is a command line tool, which fits into your continuous integration system so that you can connect it with SQL Source Control. So in the example today, we're actually using the command line tool, but just because the GUI tool is so simple to use, I just want to show it to you real quick. So if you right-click on a database, we've added a new menu item, which is Publish the Database for Deployment. This is a very, very simple wizard. It's got 4 stages to it. So in the first stage, you need to tell us where Deployment Manager is and basically the credentials to start talking to it. This is, because we've used the wizard before, it remembered it from last time. So I'll just go over that. The next thing you have to do is you need to tell us the name of the package and which version number it should be. So because I've packaged it before as the SimpleTalk .database, if I just type that in there, it will pick up the one from last time and just increment the version by 1.
That's really cool. It's worth saying as well that if you increment by whole numbers or by point numbers, it will automatically work out what increment you use and do that for you, which is really cool. It's amazing just how much thought has gone into these 2 checkboxes. It took us several meetings to decide what to do. So on page 3 of this wizard, you get to pick which tables have static data. So typically tables in your database fall into one of 2 categories. We have tables which has got like transactional data, so like articles or blogs or contacts, whereby obviously people can directly add them to the production system, probably through some kind of admin interface. So on SimpleTalk, there's an admin interface where we can go away and we can add new articles to it. So typically we wouldn't want a database deployment to affect those tables because obviously production obviously has got the latest copy. Saying orders table, user accounts table would be the similar kind of thing. Whereas some tables represent configuration data for our application. So SimpleTalk has a list of countries in the world, and similarly, which is the feature that we're adding today, it has this list of RSS feeds on the right-hand side here, which is SQL, Net, sysadmin, and opinion. So that's represented by this RSS feeds table in the database. So these 2 tables are ticked, which means that when I package up my database, we'll also package up the data in these tables, and the data in those tables will be deployed as part of a deployment. And there's a big button here which will publish it. But I'm not going to do that because so this is just going to show you what the GUI way of creating packages is. We're actually, in the webinar today, going to be using the command line tool to do it instead. And the command line tool plugs into TeamCity. So again, we'll be talking about TeamCity more towards the end. But essentially the change that I made earlier to add a new feed and also store the number of views of an article. So I made this change in SQL Source Control.
and TeamCity, which is the continuous integration system we're using for the webinar, but we also support TFS, Cruise Control, Jenkins, Hudson, so on and so forth. TeamCity has picked up that change, and it has run a build, and that build has called into one of the Redgate command line tools called the SQL Automation Pack, and that has packaged up our database into a package and given that package to Deployment Manager, which means that Deployment Manager can now deploy that out to all the different environments. In fact, ever since I made the change at the start of the webinar to add some, which I committed with SQL Source Control, whilst I've been talking, Deployment Manager has been doing its thing and deploying that out. So this is the latest environment here, and if I press F5 to refresh this, the list of 4 feeds on the right-hand side will now include another one. So if I refresh the page, you'll see that SQL Server Rocks should appear as number 5, and there it is. So this is because the latest environment is being kept automatically up to date with every single change, and so that's why the change has made it to the latest environment. If I go to the testing environment and press F5, you can see that absolutely no changes happen to the testing environment. It's still got the 4 things that it had before. So at this point, I'm going to go into Deployment Manager, and I'm going to show you how to promote the change from the latest environment to the testing environment. And we're going to do this on the dashboard. So the dashboard is showing us that we've currently got version 1.89 of our software on the testing environment and 1.90 in the latest environment. So what I want to do is I want to deploy this 1.90 release to the testing environment. And to do that, I just have to click on the 1.90 release, which will tell me all about it, and then do deploy to. And then this gives me my list of environments, and I'd like to deploy this to my testing environment. It gives me a list of the machines that I'm going to update, which obviously in your organization would be the list of all the servers in the testing environment that are going to get changed. And go ahead and click deploy this release. And what that's doing is carrying out that deployment to the testing environment. So at this point, it's probably worthwhile explaining how Deployment Manager does a deployment. So the first thing Deployment Manager has to do is it has to go and get the packages. And we're using an industry standard piece of technology here called NuGet, which is how these packages get stored. So Deployment Manager has to get the packages of your application and your database from NuGet. It has to upload those packages to the target machines, and then it just goes through each package after the other and installs it. So the way that it installs the database is it uses our SQL Compare and SQL Data Compare technology completely under the covers to generate the SQL script to alter the database, and then for the website it just updates the application in IIS to be running the new code. So this deployment is now complete, that's all gone through successfully. So now if I go back to my testing environment and press F5, you can see that the list of feeds on the right hand side has now got SQL Server Rocks. So this is the value of Deployment Manager, which is that this is now a release which I can deploy out to any of my environments. It takes 22 seconds to do a deployment. So if you imagine what it would take to do this deployment manually by hand, it would probably take a lot longer. There's the risk that you might make a mistake, particularly on production. That risk might have financial costs associated with it if production goes down. And of course, if you're doing the deployment by hand, it might rely on a particular person being in the office. So the great thing about Deployment Manager is that, assuming you've got the permissions to do it, anyone can click that button, and they don't need to know the intricate details of a long checklist to go through. And that's really the value of Deployment Manager. These releases can just be moved from one environment to the other safely without any of the risks of doing it by hand. So at this point, I'm going to hand back to Grant, who's going to talk about how this would work, not just for the database, but for the application as a whole as well. Over to you, Grant.
Nice. You guys should get like a good screen capture of the portal thing that works so people can see it. It is amazing the way it lays out. Granted, you guys have got mechanisms in place now where you can actually do deployment. You've got ability to automate. You've got the ability to get between different environments. You've got the ability to set up testing. But now you've got to do the hard part. Now you've actually got to integrate your database and your application together. This is hard. This is hard for everybody. The DBAs don't like the fact that developers move so quickly. The developers don't like the fact that DBAs move so slowly. It's a problem, right? It just is. You have to overcome it in order to get to accurate, effective deployments. And the one mechanism you can do is to integrate the database and the application together. Tools you have to do this are source control. Source control allows you to put your database and your application in the same place at the same time and label it, mark it, version it, however you have to do it, so that you know this version of the database matches this version of the app. And if there is a problem on either side, you can communicate more effectively to ensure that you've got the right stuff in the right place. Obviously, you can you label them together, you deploy them together, and I like to suggest very strongly that you deploy the database first. And the reason being is not that we're more important, it's frankly that we will fail more often, and when we fail, our failures are spectacular, right? It causes huge problems. And so if you get a successful database deployment, then you deploy your code. You wouldn't want to deploy code before deploying a database because you're going to be doing a lot more rollbacks because the databases do have a tendency to fail more and fail bigger on deployments. So deploy them first because then if they're done right, it's pretty easy to get the code right. It's getting that database deployment right is the hard part. But you guys are going to show us a little bit more about how to do this, correct?
Yep, that's right, Grant. We're going to do that now. Cool. So at this point, all we've shown is deploying a database change. And now we're going to show how to deploy an application change, which is just as easy. If you want, you can just use Deployment Manager to deploy databases by themselves, or you can use them to deploy SSAS cubes by themselves, or database with SSAS cubes. But what we're using them for today is deploying a database and a website, which uses the database. But because Deployment Manager is configurable, you can use it to deploy whatever you want. So again, so that I don't have to do live coding in front of you guys, I've actually written my application change already, but it's currently commented out. So I'm just going to uncomment it. So if you remember back at the beginning, there were two changes that we wanted to make. The first is that we wanted to deploy, the first is that we wanted to add this new thing to the right-hand side, to add SQL Server rocks. But we also wanted to add the number of views to each article. And remember, the number of views encompassed two different bits. There was the SQL Server change to store the data, and the application changes to correspond with that. Just to save time, we're not actually going to deal with incrementing the views counter, but that's just an application change that we have an article's view that you would have to call into the database to update the views. It's not really relevant to the deployment stuff. So all we're going to show today is how we actually render the number of views, which obviously will not be 0. So no, I'm uncommenting the wrong thing.
So are you confident that this code actually works, David?
Pretty much, yeah. If I uncomment the right thing, then it should work. Cool. So what we're doing here is we're just rendering the number, the results of the views column from the database row, and this is it for each. It goes to all the different articles. So if I just refresh this, and then I commit that, and click the commit button. So this is using the, I think this is AnkSVN, which is one of the plugins to Visual Studio to do source control for your application. So if I commit the commit button there, that has gone off to the version control system. Cool, so now we need to package up our application and get that into Deployment Manager as well. And just like the database, there are two different ways of doing it. There's a GUI and there's a command line. So just like our add-in for SSMS, we've also got an extension for Visual Studio. So if I right-click on my web application project here, you can see Publish for Deployment as a menu item. And then this launches off this, which you should recognize from before. This is just like we're in SSMS, only it doesn't have page 3 about static data, because there isn't static data in quite the same way for a web application. But yeah, the first page you just pick the where Deployment Manager is, and then on the second page you tell us the name of the package and the version number, and then the feed where that's going to get published to when you click the button. And again, I'm not actually going to use this GUI tool, but I just thought I'd show it to you real quick, just to show you how easy it is for you to do it. What I'm going to do instead is use the command line tool, which I'm going to use the command line tool, which is one of the Deployment Manager command line tools. So if you go to the Tools page on Deployment Manager, you can download a whole bunch of the different tools from here. So this is the SSMS add-in that I've been showing earlier to package up databases. This is the Visual Studio extension to package up websites in Visual Studio. And this is rgpublish. And rgpublish is the command line to package up websites. And if we go back over to our continuous integration system, and we go to the web application bit, you can see that this is the commit that I made 2 minutes ago, which is the change to the default.aspx file to uncomment a bit of code to render the number of views. And this is already built in TeamCity, and this has generated a package, and that package has been pushed off to Deployment Manager. We also have, so the way we've configured TeamCity, so we've got the database, which is the thing you saw before, so this generates the database package. We've got the web application, which generates the package for the web application, and then we've got this thing here. So this simple talk deploy thing is the thing that manages the deployments to that latest environment. So this is a TeamCity build, and it's watching for when the database project is built, and it's watching for when the web application project is built. And what it does is it takes the latest one of these, and it takes the latest database and the latest web application, and calls into Deployment Manager using one of the other Deployment Manager tools, using deploymentmanager.exe, to schedule an automatic deployment to the latest environment to take place immediately. So that's what the Simple Talk Deploy project is doing, and that's why the latest environment is being updated. And it's a Simple Talk Deploy project which is responsible for saying it's that version of the database and that version of the web app which work together. And it does that by just taking the latest one of these. So now if I go over to the latest environment and press F5, we can see that 42 comments is what it shows at the moment, and we can now see that it's got 0 views here, and we're rendering that on all of our articles. So this is how easy it is to make a change and deploy that change to the latest environment. And just as I did before, if I want to promote that change to my testing environment, I just have to go to the dashboard, go to 191, click the deploy button, click testing, and click the big button at the bottom of the page, and that will go ahead and deploy out that release to my testing environment. And obviously this takes a bit of time. Again, what it's doing is it's getting the packages from the package feed, uploading them to the machines, and then installing them. In this case, there won't be any database changes because all we've done is we've just made the simple code change to our website to render that extra bit of text. Even though there aren't any database changes, it's still checking that no change has been made directly to the database, just in case people like to go in and kind of add indexes directly onto production systems, for example. This check would, at this point here, we go and do a check that the database hasn't been surreptitiously changed behind the scenes, which is why that stage took a little bit longer to execute than you might have thought, given that there weren't any changes. If I go to my testing environment and press F5, when the page refreshes, you can see that this 0 views has occurred. And so it's that easy. Yeah,
from development to testing in 21 seconds.
And it's not just from development to testing, it's also to every other environment up to this point as well. I can take this change to staging, I can take this change to production, and it's that easy for changes to make their way through all the different environments. Cool. So at this point, let me just look at my slide. What am I supposed to do next? Oh yes, I'm supposed to talk about some of the other cool features of Deployment Manager. So Deployment Manager, when it deploys out to the different environments, so for those of you who write websites, you presumably know about the web config file, which is, this is the web config file here, which we don't actually need to look at, but essentially it's got all the configuration data for our website. And then underneath it, in our solution, we've got a web.latest.config, web production, web staging, web testing, and you can see we've got a different config file for each of our environments. And these config files are being maintained in source control, which is great because we get to know who's changing them. And when Deployment Manager does a deployment to the latest environment, it will use this config file, and it uses production, it uses this config file. And this is great for if there's particular bits of things you want to configure differently in the different environments. Maybe on production, you want any errors that occur working on your website, any kind of 500 invalid server errors or crashes, to go into some kind of monitoring system so that you can deal with them, whereas obviously in the latest environment you may not necessarily care about monitoring for errors quite so much as you would in production. So if you've got different bits of config in different environments, this lets you source control them and have Deployment Manager use the right bit of config during the deployments that it makes. So at this point I'm going to hand back to Grant, who's going to talk about some more stuff. Over to you, Grant.
Excellent. So here's the deal. You get everything set up, you get all this stuff going, but frankly, I mean, okay, maybe not all of you guys who are listening, and certainly not our development teams, because they're a whole lot better than I am, but I'm an idiot, and I will screw anything up given the opportunity. So the best thing I do for myself is automate processes. Now, I can still screw up the automation, absolutely, but you should only screw that up once, right? You make the mistake, you fix that bit of code, and now it's good to go. Basically, automate. Take people out of the equation in places where you can. I mean, there's places where you can't, but you take people out of the equation. This is going to make things more repeatable. And if they're more repeatable, it means you get to do it more often, meaning A, B, C, D, always be continuously deploying. And you can do that through automation. Especially, it's always going to speed up the process, too, because, you hitting click, 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 read, think, click. That's a lot slower than if you've got an automated process that's going to run as fast as the machine can do the stuff. And, all these things need to take advantage of the tools that you know. And that's the beauty of the stuff that we've set up so far, is we've got the ability to go down to the command line and automate things there. And because we're able to do that, we're actually able to plug it all into PowerShell as well. And so you can take all the different tools you know, the continuous integration tools, source control tools, our management tools for source control and deployments, and automate everything through PowerShell or through the DOS command line. Let's see an example. You guys have another one?
Cool, thank you, Grant. So we're actually kind of running out of time, so we're going to cut this bit real short. But there are a couple of things I kind of want to say. So the first thing to point out is that Deployment Manager is a general purpose deployment tool. Okay, the thing we've been using it for here is a database and a website, but Deployment Manager can deploy anything if you write PowerShell to do that deployment. And obviously you can write to PowerShell yourself, but we also have provided lots of kind of helpful ways for you to get started. So this is our PowerShell scripts forum on our public forums. And you can see that there's a whole bunch of different things that you might want to do. Maybe send emails, maybe deploy Oracle databases, maybe deploy things via FTP. And because you can deploy Azure websites via FTP, that means you can also deploy Azure websites. Also, Windows services are somewhere in here. There's SSAS cubes are in here as well. Windows services are there. So, and we're adding to these more over time. So when my teammates is looking at SSIS, another one's looking at SSRS, and we're going to add more and more of these PowerShell scripts over time. And of course, you can always write them yourselves as well. This is just a great way for you to get started so that you don't need to repeat all the work that we've already done for you to deploy different components. So the cool thing about this is that you can get more and more of the different bits of your application, the different components, onto being deployed with Deployment Manager, which means that you get all the benefits of the repeatability of the deployments and the fact that you're no longer using a manual process. So at this point, I should... Cool, so at this point, I just want to... Andrew, we're going straight to this at the end. Yep, why not? Cool, yeah. So as I said at the start, Deployment Manager is available for download right now. We first released it in November last year, so we've certainly ironed out a lot of the kinks. So it's pretty much good to go. Version 2 came out a couple months ago, I think. It was mid-June. Yeah, mid-June. Time has flown since then. And the reason why time has flown is that we've pretty much been releasing every week since then, delivering a whole bunch of new features. So Windows Authentication came out recently, masking the passwords and the variable values. That came out recently as well, all these little nice asterisks over here. That's one of the features we've done recently. And also the PowerShell scripts, which is what we're currently working on. So it's certainly kind of very busy here as we kind of keep adding features.
We call Wednesdays Release Wednesdays, and we release every single Wednesday.
So in fact, we're releasing tomorrow. There won't be that much this week because most of the stuff we've been doing is PowerShell scripts, which we've just been putting up onto the forums as soon as we've been writing them. But yeah, we're going to release tomorrow. One thing I should say is that, yeah, which I said at the beginning, but I'll just repeat it. Deployment Manager is quite a special Redgate tool. So normally Redgate tools come with a free trial, which expires, whereas that's not the case with Deployment Manager. It has a free edition which has no time limit on it. You can keep using the free edition for as long as you like. It does have a limitation, however, it limits you to 5 projects and also to 5 machines. But you can, as many users as you like can interact with Deployment Manager, but you are limited to just 5 projects down here.
But it's really awesome. So if you want to get set up on a couple of databases, maybe if you want to test out a few deployments, or if you've got a project that you're working on, on the side, maybe at home, it's a really great way of getting used to the tool, understanding how it works, and then if you want to, you can roll it out to more projects and share it with your colleagues, and then get set up and have more of a sort of continuous delivery process. So it's really great for that.
Cool. And not only is it a free edition, but it's actually quite reasonably priced as well if you go over the 5 projects or the 5 environments. So I'm going to hand you over to Andrew, who's going to talk through the offer that we've got for people today.
Yeah, so Professional is normally $995, and the Enterprise Edition, which is sort of the much sort of bigger enterprise version, is normally $2,995. However, for webinar attendees today, we've got a special offer, so we're going to give you 20% off Deployment Manager Professional and Enterprise. So you save $200 on Professional and $600 on Enterprise. If you're interested in that and want to find out more, just contact alex.yates@redgate.com and just tell him that you saw the webinar and quote the code webinar0309. So that's a really awesome offer. And if you've got any questions, just contact Alex. So I think it's probably time now for questions and answers. So if you've got any questions, feel free to type them and submit them. We've already had quite a few, so maybe if we get started, we've got one here, which is, where should we start? Okay, so I guess the first obvious one is, will a recording of this session be available online? Yes, it will. I'll give you more details later, but we're going to upload it hopefully tomorrow or the day after onto futureofdeployment.com. We will also upload it onto YouTube and to SQLServerCentral.com. Cool, so the next question, what should we do? Bear with us a second. Okay, so if there's a problem with deployment, how do you roll back? So Simon's thinking about large databases where you just can't do, say, a restore or a backup. What are the rollback options? Justin?
Right, finally I get to talk, thank you. There are a couple of options for this one. So inside the Deployment Manager tool, you can deploy a previous release, and then the compare technology will use the previous schema, and it will basically put things back the way they were. Obviously, if you've been making changes, or if there's transactional data that's been added to the database since that point, that's always going to be a challenge. We do provide scripts, a script on the script forum that was shown earlier, where you can use that to back up a database using SQL backup before the deployment. So you can make sure you've always got that snapshot that you can go back to as well for the cases that are a bit harder to roll back. But yeah, there's a couple of options there.
Cool, so there's a question, someone said that they saw that it supports Azure SQL. Does it support Amazon Web Services RDS? And the answer is yes. So Amazon Web Services RDS is just a normal SQL server. So as far as Deployment Manager is concerned, it's a SQL server just like anything else. So you have to obviously type in the host name. I can't remember precisely what the format of them is, but I obviously give it credentials. And obviously you have to go into the Amazon console and allow the IP address of the Deployment Manager agent to connect to it. Just a very quick question from the same guy actually about whether an agent install is needed for SQL deployments. So we should kind of explain a little bit more about how Deployment Manager works at this point. So Deployment Manager always does deployments from an agent. So even for SQL Server deployments, it does them from an agent as well. And the reason why that's useful is you might have SQL servers on network segments that aren't accessible from the Deployment Manager server. So even for SQL Server deployments, you have to pick an agent that will be which will be the agent talking to the SQL Server. So although the deployment may or may not be taking place on that agent computer, you still have to tell Deployment Manager to do the SQL Server deployment via an agent. And then that means that if you've got SQL servers on network segments which are isolated from the Deployment Manager server, you just have to install a Deployment Manager agent on the same network segment as it, and then everything will be fine. So yeah, even for Amazon even for the RDS support on Amazon, you'll still need to install an agent, but you can just install it on the same machine as the deployment manager.
So just jumping back to the last question about Azure support, if you go back to the other slide, David, so on this site, thefutureofdeployment.com, I'm going to be publishing an article tomorrow, hopefully, or the day after, about how you can deploy to SQL Azure and how simple it is. So there'll be a full guide and a walkthrough. So I guess the pressure's on for me to finish writing that now, isn't it?
Absolutely, yes.
Okay, so we've got another question, which is, how can I automate deploying the same packages to multiple, say hundreds of databases? Is that possible?
Yes, it is possible. In terms of how you would actually add those machines to the dashboard, I mean, you saw with the dashboard that the tool at the moment will have some scalability problems if you're talking hundreds of different environments that you want to deploy to independently. That's something which we need to get to. In terms of the, if you're doing that, or if you're doing them all at the same time, what you could do is you could just add in multiple machines to each of those, or add in multiple steps to deploy the same package to each of those machines. With a recent release that's either released last Wednesday or is going to be released tomorrow, we've also improved or added an agent cache. So for each of these steps, it would not resend the same package down to the agent each time. It would do that just the once. So that makes that process a whole lot more efficient.
Cool. So we had a question, do I need to repackage if the QA fails and we need to put a code fix in? And then the follow-up to that is, how do you keep other developer changes from getting into the package and deploy just a single fix? So the answer is absolutely yes, you do need to repackage. So any time that you change the code, you need to create a new package. And the reason why you have to do that is because packages are immutable. And that means because packages are immutable, you get all the benefits. And if you deploy the same package again, you get the same results, which is great for deploying from to different environments. So yeah, if it fails QA and you have to make a code change, you will have to repackage it. And then so the follow-up question to that was, well, if you're repackaging it, how do you make sure that you've got just the fix in question and not the other fixes? So this really comes down to your way of working. So for us, so the way that we release the deployment manager every week is we use branches in our source control system. So what this means is that we can do some work on the default branch, and then when we want it to go out in that Wednesday, we just merge it from the default branch onto the release branch. So what this means is that by using branching and merging and cherry picking in your version control system, you can, and assuming that you're creating packages from the release branch, this means that by just merging one commit onto the release branch, you can then make sure that you can package up the release branch and just deploy the single fix that you meant and keep all your other work in progress, not deployed out to the different environments. That's how we release safely every week, even though we've got, at the moment, we're looking at how we can run 64-bit PowerShell as opposed to just 32-bit. And that's not going to make tomorrow's release because it's quite risky change and we started it yesterday. So we're not ready quite to release that yet. But we will be releasing a whole bunch of other stuff tomorrow.
Cool.
We can do that by using branching in our version control system.
Cool. So we had another question, which is, I missed part 1 of the webinar. Where can I get a copy of the slides and video? So I've actually last week uploaded the video to the Future of Deployment. So if you go to thefutureofdeployment.com and you scroll down, it's the second article there at the moment, and there is a video. I haven't actually uploaded the slides, but I can do that. But the slides are in the video. Cool. I think we've got time for probably one more question now. We are quite short on time. So what's the next question we should answer?
So the question's just come in, can you package off of revision numbers for trunk-based development? The answer is yes. Depends, you do it in different ways depending on which tool you're using. So if you're using any of the command line tools, then you need to do this using your continuous integration system. So if you go into, so the way that you might do this in TeamCity is that you go into the project and you click these 3 little dots next to run, and then you get to pick, when the dialog comes up, you get to pick which change you'd like to put in. So you can say, I just want a package of this revision, everything up to this point, or everything up to this point. And obviously this works for both packaging databases and websites from the command line. In terms of how you do it with our GUIs, this is a feature that people have asked for. So I think this is number 2 on our priority list. Or is it number 1? It's number 1, isn't it?
Yeah. So when we're talking about databases specifically, then we have the obviously we have the SQL source control tool as well. And what we'd like to do is we'd just like to join the story between these tools a little bit better. And obviously source control has a concept of revision numbers, and we'd like the ability to be able to deploy from any of those revisions directly. So it means that rather than taking any, and this kind of also addresses the earlier question a little bit too, because it means that you can take a known state that's checked into the source control system, whereas obviously other changes may have been made to the database. You can take the changes directly from source control from any revision, and then you can package those directly. So that's a feature that we're going to be working on very shortly. I think we've already sort of planned out various stories for it.
Yeah, so we have designs for it. It's the whiteboard where we plan the work we do is quite epic. So this is currently in the ready for dev category, and it's top of that list. So I'm expecting we'll probably start it at the end of this week, and maybe it might be out in a couple of weeks' time. Depends quite how long it takes. But so yeah, that's one of the things we really want to add into the SSMS add-in, just so that it can join the story up with SQL Source Control and provide a kind of more connected experience, particularly for people who don't have continuous integration servers. So if you've got a CI server, and chances are the application people in your organization might have one, we've got all the command lines for you, but not everyone has a CI system, and so that's great because if we improve our add-ins, then you won't need to set one up quite in those many cases.
Cool, so I think that's about all we have time for today. Thanks for everything, Grant. It was sort of really great. Thanks for giving us the introduction and sort of giving us sort of the overview of the webinar. Thanks, David, for the awesome demo, Justin for answering questions, and most importantly, thank you everyone for attending, and thanks for all of your awesome questions. As we said before, the recordings will be available online at thefutureofdeployment.com, and yeah, feel free to email Alex and take advantage of the awesome offer. Great, thanks a lot, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you. Cheers.
Bye.